What if you grew up in a world that no longer exists but somehow you still remember exactly what it felt like? You remember life before smartphones, before social media, before everyone carried the internet in their pocket. You learned how to entertain yourself, how to find your way without GPS, and how to wait for something instead of expecting it instantly. Then technology arrived, and you adapted. You went from cassette tapes to streaming, from handwritten notes to instant messages, from landlines to smartphones. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, there's a good chance you're a Xennial. You're part of a unique generation that experienced childhood mostly offline but adulthood during the digital revolution. And some of the things you do today may reveal that you're a Xennial without even realizing it. Here are 10 signs that might give you away. Sign 1. You remember life before the internet. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you probably remember a time when the internet simply wasn't part of everyday life. If you wanted information, you searched through books. If you wanted to talk to someone, you picked up a landline. And if you were bored, you had to figure out something to do. There were no endless notifications, no social media feeds, and no instant answers waiting in your pocket. You experienced a slower world where patience was normal and being disconnected wasn't unusual, and maybe that's why even today part of you still misses the feeling of having nothing demanding your attention. Because you didn't just grow up before the internet, you remember what life felt like without it. Sign 2. You use both landlines and smartphones. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you probably remember when making a phone call meant walking over to a phone attached to the wall. If someone called the house, everyone knew, and if you wanted privacy, you had to stretch that long phone cord as far as it could possibly go. Then technology changed everything. Suddenly, phones became portable. Then came texting, internet access, video calls, and eventually, smartphones that could do almost everything. You experienced both worlds. You remember when a phone was simply a way to call someone, and you also live in a world where your phone is your camera, map, calendar, bank, and connection to the entire world. That's a uniquely Xennial experience. Because you didn't grow up with smartphones, you watched them become part of everyday life. Sign 3. You know how to be bored. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you probably remember when being bored was simply being bored. There was no smartphone to pick up, no endless videos to scroll through, no social media waiting for your attention. When you had nothing to do, you had to create something to do. Maybe you rode your bike, played outside, listened to music, called a friend, or simply sat there and let your imagination take over. And strangely, boredom taught you something important: patience. You learned that every quiet moment didn't need to be filled with stimulation. Today, silence can feel uncomfortable, but you remember when silence was normal. Because you grew up in a world where entertainment wasn't always one click away. You learned how to entertain yourself. Sign 4. You remember music on physical media. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you probably remember when music wasn't something you simply searched for. You had cassette tapes, CDs, and maybe even records. You waited for your favorite song to come on the radio, and when it finally played, you carefully pressed record. You might have made mixtapes for yourself or for someone you cared about. Music wasn't everywhere. You had to choose what you wanted to listen to, and sometimes you listened to the same album over and over again. Today, millions of songs are available instantly, but there's something special about remembering when music felt physical, personal, and worth waiting for. Because you didn't grow up with unlimited streaming, you remember when music was something you held in your hands. Sign 5. You learned technology instead of growing up with it. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, technology wasn't always there to guide you. You remember when computers felt complicated, when learning new software took patience, and when getting online wasn't as simple as opening an app. You didn't grow up with technology in your pocket, you watched it arrive, slowly changing the way people worked, communicated, and lived. You went from VHS tapes to DVDs, from cassette players to MP3s, from dial-up internet to smartphones. And every time technology changed, you had to learn something new. That's what makes your experience different. You didn't simply inherit the digital world, you adapted to it. You remember the frustration of learning technology and the excitement of realizing what it could do. Because you lived through the transition from an analog childhood to a digital adulthood. Sign 6, you remember going somewhere without GPS. You probably remember when getting somewhere meant knowing the route before you left. There was no phone telling you, turn left in 500 feet. You used road signs, paper maps, or simply asked someone for directions. Sometimes you got lost, and honestly you just had to figure it out. Maybe someone in the passenger seat was unfolding a giant map while everyone argued about which road to take. Today you can reach almost anywhere with a few taps. But you remember when traveling required preparation, patience, and sometimes a little adventure. You grew up in a world where getting lost wasn't an emergency. It was sometimes just part of the journey. Sign 7, you value privacy more than constant sharing. You probably remember when not every moment of your life had to be shared. You could go on vacation, eat at a restaurant, or spend time with friends without taking pictures for everyone to see. There was no pressure to constantly post where you were, what you were doing, or how you were feeling. Some moments were simply private, and maybe that's why, even today, you don't feel the need to document everything. You can enjoy a beautiful moment without turning it into a post. You can have a personal thought without sharing it with hundreds of people. Because you grew up understanding something that's easy to forget today. Not everything meaningful needs an audience. Sometimes the best memories are the ones you keep for yourself. Sign 8, you adapted to social media later in life. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, social media wasn't part of your childhood. You didn't grow up posting photos, sharing every thought, or checking notifications every few minutes. Social media arrived later when you already had a sense of who you were. You watched platforms change the way people communicate, make friends, share their lives, and even build careers. At first, it probably felt strange. Then slowly, you learned how to navigate this new digital world. But deep down, you still remember what life felt like before everyone was constantly connected. That's what makes your experience unique. You didn't grow up inside social media. You grew up first and then watched social media become part of the world. Sign 9, you still have a soft spot for the past. Sometimes the smallest thing can take you back decades. An old song, a familiar smell, a movie you watched as a kid, a photograph, or even the sound of an old cassette player. Suddenly, you're not thinking about the present anymore. You're remembering a simpler time. Maybe you're back in your childhood bedroom, riding your bike after school, or sitting with friends without anyone checking a phone. That's the strange power of nostalgia. You don't just remember those moments, you feel them. And maybe that's why you still have a soft spot for the past. Not because you want to live there, but because those memories remind you of a version of yourself that existed before life became so complicated. Sometimes an old song isn't just a song. It's a doorway back to who you used to be. Sign 10, you feel like you belong to neither generation completely. You may sometimes feel like you're caught between two worlds. You're not quite like the older generation, but you don't completely relate to younger generations either. You remember life before smartphones, but you also learned how to navigate the digital world. You remember paper maps, landline, and physical music, but today you can use apps, streaming, and technology just as easily. You've experienced both sides. The slower, quieter world you were born into and the fast, connected world that came afterward. And sometimes that can make you feel like you don't completely belong anywhere. But maybe that's not a weakness. Maybe it's your greatest advantage. You understand the patience of the old world and the possibilities of the new one. You are part of a generation that bridged the gap between them. And perhaps that's what being a Xennial really means. You don't belong to just one world because you remember both. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you experienced something incredibly rare. You didn't just grow up. You watched the world transform around you. You experienced childhood without smartphones, adolescence before social media, and adulthood during one of the biggest technological revolutions in history. You learned how to live without technology and then learned how to live with it. You belong to a generation that remembers both sides, the quiet world and the connected world, the slow world and the instant world. And maybe that's why Xennials often feel like a bridge between generations. So here's the question. How many of these 10 signs described you? And what's the one childhood memory from the 1976-1985 era that you would never want to forget? Tell me in the comments. And if this brought back some memories, like this video, subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more psychology, nostalgia, and generational content. Because some generations experienced history, but you experienced the transition between two completely different worlds.